What if Babylon wasn't destroyed because it fell, but because it had to be erased? What if the greatest city the ancient world had ever known, the city of hanging gardens and ziggurat towers, the city where astronomy was born and law was first codified, became so dangerous, so threatening to something we no longer understand, that every empire that followed participated in its systematic obliteration? The ruins still stand in the Iraqi desert, baked silent under a sun that has watched for 5,000 years. And scattered in museums across the world, clay tablets still carry warnings, urgent messages pressed into wet mud by scribes who knew their city was marked for annihilation. So before the story pulls you under, if you're drawn to histories that refuse to stay buried, consider subscribing. If you travel to Iraq today, known to the modern city of Hilla, about 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, you can stand on a mound of earth that rises from the flat Mesopotamian plain and look out over what remains of the most famous city in ancient history. And what you will see is almost nothing, just undulating hills of brown earth dotted with fragments of brick, the occasional exposed foundation wall, and vast stretches of emptiness where the greatest metropolis the world had ever known once stood. And this absence is itself a mystery, because cities of comparable fame have left far more behind. Rome still has its Colosseum and its forums, Athens its Acropolis and its temples, Egypt its pyramids standing virtually intact after 4,500 years. Yet Babylon, which the ancient sources describe as the most magnificent city ever built, a city whose walls Herodotus claimed were so thick that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them, a city with temples sheathed in gold and gardens that seemed to float in the air, has left us with almost nothing you could photograph for a postcard. And when the German archaeologist Robert Coldway arrived in 1899 to begin what would become an 18-year excavation, the most ambitious archaeological project of its era, he expected to uncover wonders that would rival or surpass what Schliemann had found at Troy and Mycenae, what the French had found at Susa, what the British had found at Nineveh. He expected to find the legendary walls, the temples, the palaces described in cuneiform texts and Greek histories. And what he found instead was a puzzle, not the absence of a city, but the skeleton of one. The foundations without the structures, the outlines without the substance, as if someone had systematically stripped away everything worth taking and left only what was too heavy or too worthless to move. And this is precisely what had happened. Not once, but repeatedly over centuries. Each conquering power taking what they wanted. Each successor civilization treating Babylon not as a heritage to preserve, but as a quarry to mine. And the most spectacular find of Coldway's excavation illustrates this perfectly, because the Ishtar Gate, that magnificent structure covered in glazed blue bricks depicting lions and dragons and bulls in yellow and white, the gate that once marked the entrance to the processional way leading to the great temple of Marduk. Coldway found it not standing proudly as it had for centuries, but buried under meters of debris, its bricks scattered and disordered, and he spent years carefully excavating, cataloguing, and eventually shipping hundreds of crates of these bricks back to Berlin, where the gate was painstakingly reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum where it stands today. And if you visit that museum, you can walk through the Ishtar Gate and feel something of the awe that ancient visitors must have felt approaching Babylon. But you are walking through it in Germany, not Iraq. And this displacement is itself part of the story of Babylon's erasure, its treasures scattered across the museums of the world, while the actual site remains a field of dirt and broken brick. And you might think this is simply what happens to ancient cities. That time and weather and the reuse of building materials gradually reduce everything to rubble. But the pattern at Babylon suggests something more deliberate, because the stripping began almost immediately after the city fell to the Persians in 539 BCE, accelerated dramatically after Alexander the Great died there in 323 BCE, and reached its culmination when the Seleucid rulers who inherited Alexander's Eastern Empire made a decision that sealed Babylon's fate. They built a new capital called Seleucia on the Tigris, just 60 kilometers away, and they systematically depopulated Babylon to fill it, moving not just people, but building materials, statues, temple furnishings, administrative records, everything that made a city function and everything that made it magnificent. And Alexander himself had recognized Babylon's importance. He had planned to make it the capital of his world empire, had begun the massive project of rebuilding the ziggurat at Temenanki that had fallen into disrepair. But he died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar at the age of 32, and some ancient sources hint darkly that his death was no accident, that the Babylonian priests whose power he was restoring had enemies who preferred the city remain diminished, though we cannot know the truth of this. And after Alexander, the process of erasure accelerated, generation by generation, century by century, until by the time of Christ, the greatest city in the ancient world had become a village, and by the Islamic era it had become a mound, and by the modern era it had become a name that echoed through religious texts and literature, while the reality of what it had been faded into legend and speculation. But to understand why Babylon had to be erased, you must first understand what Babylon actually was at its height, not the cursed city of biblical narrative, not the symbol of human pride and divine punishment, but the actual functioning metropolis that dominated the ancient world for the better part of 2,000 years. And the scale alone is staggering to contemplate. Because at its peak under Nebuchadnezzar, the second in the 6th century BCE, Babylon covered approximately 2,500 acres within its inner walls, making it larger than any city that would exist in Europe until London in the 19th century, with a population that scholars estimate between 200,000 and possibly as high as 500,000 people, depending on how you count the surrounding suburbs and dependent settlements. A concentration of humanity unprecedented in human history to that point, fed by an agricultural system based on the most sophisticated irrigation networks the world had ever seen. Networks that turned the arid plains between the Tigris and Euphrates into the most productive farmland on Earth. And through the center of this vast city ran the Euphrates itself, not skirting the walls as rivers usually do, but flowing directly through the heart of the urban core, spanned by bridges and flanked by quays where boats from the Persian Gulf brought goods from India and Arabia and Africa. A river that the Babylonians had learned to control with such precision that they could raise and lower its level according to the needs of agriculture and urban sanitation. A feat of engineering that still challenges modern hydrologists to fully understand. And rising above the sprawl of residential districts and marketplaces and workshops was the religious and administrative center, a complex of temples and palaces that ancient visitors described in terms that seemed like exaggeration until archaeology began to confirm their essential accuracy. The Erasure Temple of Marduk, with its cedarwood doors and gold plating, the palace complex covering more area than Versailles, and towering over everything the ziggurat called Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, the structure that would become immortalized in Hebrew scripture as the Tower of Babel, a stepped pyramid that rose in 7 stages to a height that ancient sources variously estimate between 60 and 90 meters, topped by a temple where the god Marduk was believed to descend to commune with his priests. A structure so massive that when Alexander the Great decided to rebuild it after finding it in ruins, the mere clearing of the debris required 10,000 men working for 2 months, and the project was still unfinished when he died. And surrounding this temple complex were the famous walls, the double fortification that Herodotus described in such detail that scholars once dismissed his account as fantasy, until excavation proved him largely accurate. An outer wall and an inner wall with a moat between them. The inner wall so wide that small houses were built into its thickness. The whole circuit running for approximately 18 kilometers and pierced by 8 major gates, each named for a deity, of which the Ishtar Gate was merely the most splendid. And whether the Hanging Gardens actually existed in Babylon remains debated among scholars, with some arguing they were actually located in Nineveh and became attributed to Babylon through centuries of confusion, while others argue that the gardens were real but represented something different from the floating terraces of later imagination. Perhaps an elaborate rooftop garden system or an artificial mountain built to please a homesick queen. But regardless of this particular question, the overall picture is clear. This was a city built to impress, built to dominate, built to project power and inspire awe on a scale that the ancient world had never seen and would not see again for millennia. The first great builder of Babylon, the man who transformed it from a minor city-state into the capital of an empire, was Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE, during what historians call the First Babylonian Empire, or the Old Babylonian period. And though this empire would eventually fall to Hittite and Kassite invaders, Hammurabi established patterns that would define Babylon for all its subsequent history, patterns of centralized administration, of legal codification, of religious syncretism that unified the various Mesopotamian traditions under the supremacy of Marduk and his most famous legacy, the law code that bears his name, was carved into a black stone stele that now stands in the Louvre, showing Hammurabi receiving the authority to judge from Shamash, the sun god, followed by nearly 300 laws covering everything from wages and prices to family relations to professional liability, including the famous principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which seems brutal to modern readers, but actually represented a limitation on vengeance, a replacement of uncontrolled blood feud with measured and proportional response. And this code was revolutionary, not primarily for its content, since similar laws existed in earlier Sumerian codes, but for its claim to universal application, its assertion that the king of Babylon ruled by divine right with authority over all peoples. And this claim would echo through the centuries as each subsequent Babylonian ruler reasserted it, reaching its fullest expression under Nebuchadnezzar II, who built the Babylon of legend, the Babylon that would be destroyed and Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 605 to 562 BCE during the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the last great flourishing of independent Mesopotamian civilization before the Persian conquest. And his reign represents both the apex of Babylonian power and the beginning of its transformation into the symbol of evil that it would become in biblical and later Western thought, because it was Nebuchadnezzar who destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE, who burned the Temple of Solomon, who deported the Jewish elite to Babylon in the event known as the Babylonian exile. And this single act, more than any other, would determine how Babylon would be remembered. Because the Jewish scribes who were carried to Babylon and their descendants would eventually produce texts that shaped three world religions. And in those texts, Babylon became the antithesis of Jerusalem, the earthly city opposed to the heavenly one, the embodiment of pride and luxury and idolatry, destined for divine destruction. And it is almost impossible now to recover a view of Babylon that is not filtered through this lens, to see the city as its own citizens saw it, rather than as its victims portrayed it. But the cuneiform records that Babylonian scribes left behind tell a different story, not of a cursed city, but of a confident civilization that believed itself to be the center of the world, the guardian of ancient knowledge, the favorite of the gods, and Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions, which survive in abundance, describe his building projects with a pride that borders on obsession, cataloguing every temple restored, every wall strengthened, every canal dug, presenting himself as the pious servant of Marduk, who glorified the god through magnificent construction. And these inscriptions contain almost no mention of military conquests, no boasting of enemies destroyed or cities burned, focusing almost entirely on building and restoration, which tells us something about how Babylonian kings wanted to be remembered, as builders, not destroyers, as restorers of cosmic order, not agents of chaos. A self-image that stands in stark contrast to the biblical portrayal and raises the question of which image is closer to the truth, or whether truth itself has been one of the casualties of Babylon's erasure. What made Babylon truly dangerous, what made it a target for erasure rather than mere conquest, was not its walls or its armies or even its wealth, but its knowledge. Because the Babylonians had accumulated over 2,000 years of continuous intellectual tradition by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, a tradition that encompassed mathematics and astronomy and medicine and divination and literature and law, all recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets and stored in temple libraries and royal archives. And the scale of this knowledge repository rivaled or exceeded anything that would exist until the great libraries of the Hellenistic world, which were themselves in many ways attempts to recreate and surpass what Babylon had achieved, and consider just the field of astronomy, the Babylonians had been systematically observing and recording celestial phenomena since at least the second millennium BCE, creating a continuous record of astronomical observations spanning well over 1,000 years. And from these observations, they derived predictive models of astonishing accuracy, discovering the Saros cycle that allows the prediction of lunar and solar eclipses, calculating the length of the year to within minutes of modern measurements, developing the zodiac system that we still use to divide the celestial sphere, creating the first comprehensive star catalogues in the tablets called Muel.apin, that listed the stars and constellations with their rising and setting times and their relationships to the agricultural calendar. And this astronomical knowledge was not pursued for its own sake, but was intimately connected to religion and politics, because the movements of the stars were believed to encode divine messages about the fate of kingdoms and kings, which meant that the priests who could read these messages held enormous power, the power to advise rulers, to legitimate dynasties, to warn of disasters and promise prosperity, and this combination of accurate prediction and political authority made Babylonian astral science extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily dangerous. Valuable because anyone who possessed it gained genuine predictive capability along with the cultural prestige of ancient wisdom. Dangerous because it represented an alternative source of authority to whatever religious or political system might wish to claim exclusive truth. And we know that this knowledge was actively sought by Babylon's conquerors, because we can trace its transmission from Babylon to Persia, to Greece, and eventually to the medieval Islamic and European worlds, each civilization taking what it could use and often forgetting or suppressing the source. And we know that this knowledge was also suppressed and condemned, particularly by the emerging monotheistic traditions that could not easily accommodate a system in which the stars governed human fate and specialized priests mediated between heaven and earth. And the mathematical knowledge was equally impressive and equally consequential. The Babylonians developed a place value notation system using base 60 that allowed them to perform calculations of remarkable complexity, a system we still preserve in our 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. And they solved quadratic equations, calculated square roots and cube roots, understood the relationship we call the Pythagorean theorem centuries before Pythagoras, created multiplication tables and tables of reciprocals and tables of powers that standardized mathematical calculation across their entire administrative apparatus. And this mathematical knowledge too was preserved and transmitted and eventually absorbed into Greek and later Western mathematics, though again often with the source forgotten or denied. And in medicine, the Babylonians accumulated diagnostic and therapeutic knowledge that would influence Greek and ultimately modern medical practice, organizing their medical texts into systematic catalogues of symptoms and treatments, developing a pharmacopoeia of plant and mineral medicines, attempting to understand the body as an integrated system rather than a collection of independent parts. And all of this knowledge was threatened by the transformations that followed Babylon's conquest. Threatened, not because the conquerors were barbarians who despised learning, but because knowledge embedded in a particular religious and cultural system becomes problematic when that system is rejected or suppressed. The libraries of Babylon were not single centralized institutions like the later Library of Alexandria, but distributed networks of tablet collections housed in temples and palaces and schools, maintained by generations of scribes who copied and preserved and commented upon the accumulated wisdom of their civilization. And the primary library was housed in the Esagila complex, the temple of Marduk in the heart of the city, where priests maintained the religious and astronomical and ritual texts that governed Babylonian worship. But there were also collections in the royal palace, collections in the houses of wealthy families who maintained private scribal traditions, collections in the bit tupi or tablet houses where young scribes were trained, and these collections together probably numbered in the hundreds of thousands of tablets, of which we have recovered perhaps 50,000 from Babylon itself, and another 100,000 or more from other Mesopotamian sites, which sounds like a lot until you realize it may represent only a small fraction of what once existed, and the question of what happened to the rest is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Some tablets were certainly destroyed, broken up for rubble fill or ground to dust by the elements over millennia. Some were carried off by conquerors, the Persians and the Greeks, and later the Parthians and the Romans, each taking what interested them. Some may still lie buried beneath the Iraqi soil, waiting for excavation that may never come given the political instability of the region. But the pattern of loss is not random. We have far more economic and administrative documents than we do scientific and religious texts, as if the conquerors and the elements conspired to preserve the mundane while destroying the significant. And we know that Babylonian scribes were aware of the threats facing their libraries because we have evidence of deliberate burial, tablets carefully placed in jars and sealed and hidden beneath floors, presumably with the intention of protecting them until the danger passed and they could be recovered, a recovery that in most cases never came. And we can compare this to the Library of Alexandria, whose destruction became legendary, a symbol of knowledge lost to fire and fanaticism. But the Alexandrian Library was a Greek institution preserving mostly Greek and Egyptian texts. Its destruction was mourned because it was the destruction of our intellectual ancestors, while the destruction of Babylon's libraries occurred before the Alexandrian Library even existed, and was so complete that for 2,000 years no one could read what had survived, the cuneiform script becoming as illegible as if it had been written in an alien language. And when decipherment finally came in the 19th century and scholars began to understand what had been lost, the enormity of the destruction became apparent. We had recovered the fragments of a civilization that once knew more about the heavens than any other people on earth. That had accumulated centuries of systematic observation and calculation, that had developed mathematical and medical and legal traditions of remarkable sophistication. And almost all of it had been allowed to perish, not preserved and transmitted like Greek philosophy or Egyptian religion, but simply abandoned to time and silence. And the question that haunts anyone who studies this material is whether this abandonment was accidental or deliberate, whether Babylon simply faded away as cities do, or whether something about Babylonian knowledge made it dangerous enough to be actively suppressed. And as your breathing slows and the weight of these questions settles over you like the dust that now covers the mounds of Babel, consider what it would mean if the greatest repository of ancient knowledge was not lost but erased, not forgotten but deliberately silenced, and consider what might have survived despite the erasure, what might still be waiting to be found, what might still be readable if we only knew where to look and how to understand what we see. Now we enter the territory where the destruction becomes deliberate, where the pattern of erasure begins to take shape across centuries and empires, where we can trace the hands that dismantled not just a city, but an entire way of understanding the world. Let us return to the Cyrus cylinder, that clay barrel we encountered at the beginning of our journey, because what it contains is not simply a declaration of conquest, but something far more sophisticated and far more insidious, the first recorded instance of what we might call narrative warfare. are the deliberate reframing of a civilization's identity to justify its subjugation. The text on the cylinder, when you read it carefully, when you parse its Akkadian phrases with the attention they deserve, reveals a propaganda strategy so effective that it has shaped how we think about Babylon for 2,500 years. Cyrus did not present himself as a foreign conqueror descending upon a proud civilization. He presented himself as a liberator, as a restorer, as the chosen instrument of Babylon's own chief deity. The cylinder declares that Marduk, the great god of Babylon, the divine patron whose temple Esagila stood at the spiritual center of the city, had grown angry with Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon's last native king. Marduk surveyed all the lands searching for a righteous ruler, the text proclaims, and he selected Cyrus, the king of Anshan, calling him by name, pronouncing him to be king of all the world. Think about what this claim accomplishes. It transforms the Persian conquest from an act of imperial aggression into an act of divine restoration. It suggests that Babylon deserved to fall, that its own god had abandoned it, that the Persians were not invaders but saviors responding to cosmic invitation. The city's subjugation becomes not a tragedy, but a correction, not a loss, but a return to proper order. This is the first erasure, and it happens not through destruction, but through reinterpretation. The cylinder goes further, detailing what Nebuchadnezzar supposedly did wrong. He imposed strange rites upon the city, the text claims. He disrupted the proper worship. He brought foreign gods into temples where they did not belong. Modern scholars have debated endlessly what Nebuchadnezzar actually did. Whether he truly neglected Marduk in favor of the moon god Sin. Whether his long sojourn in the Arabian oasis of Tamar represented religious heterodoxy or political strategy. Whether the accusations against him were based in fact or fabricated for propaganda purposes. The truth likely contains elements of both. Nebuchadnezzar was an unusual king, scholarly, antiquarian, interested in reviving ancient religious practices that had fallen into neglect. He may indeed have favored Sin over Marduk in ways that disturbed the powerful Marduk priesthood in Babylon. But whatever his actual offenses, the Cyrus cylinder transforms them into cosmic sins, requiring divine intervention, transforms a political conquest into a theological necessity, and transforms the Persian king into the savior that Babylon's own god demanded. And here is where the pattern becomes visible, because this same narrative structure, this same claim that Babylon deserved its fate, that its fall was divinely ordained, that its conquerors were instruments of justice rather than agents of destruction. This same story would be told again and again by every empire that followed. The Persians told it first, but the Hebrews would tell it with even greater force, and the Christians would tell it with eschatological finality, and even modern historians would unconsciously echo its assumptions when they portrayed Babylon's fall as the inevitable consequence of decadence and decline. The cylinder tells us something else important about Cyrus's actual policies, and this too shaped how Babylon would be remembered. Cyrus presented himself as a restorer of temples, a returner of exiled peoples, a king who reversed the displacements and deportations of previous rulers. I returned the gods to their sacred cities, the text declares. I gathered their scattered peoples and returned them to their dwellings. This policy of religious tolerance and cultural restoration was genuine, as far as our evidence suggests. Cyrus did allow deported peoples to return to their homelands. He did permit the restoration of temples and traditional worship practices. And most significantly for the subsequent history of how Babylon would be remembered, he allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This act of Persian policy would have consequences that Cyrus could never have imagined. The Jewish community that returned from Babylon carried with them not only their sacred texts, but their experience of exile, their trauma of displacement, their theological interpretation of why they had suffered and what it meant that they had survived. And they carried something else, a vision of Babylon as the enemy, as the destroyer of their temple, as the embodiment of everything their God opposed. We will return to this biblical construction shortly, but for now note that it was made possible by Cyrus's liberation. The very act that the cylinder celebrates as mercy and restoration, the freeing of the Jewish exiles, created the conditions for Babylon's transformation into cosmic villain. The peoples Cyrus released would write the texts that would shape how billions of subsequent humans understood Babylon, not as a center of learning and civilization, but as a symbol of pride and corruption and divine judgment. This is how erasure works. It proceeds not through simple destruction, but through transformation of meaning, through the capture and redirection of narrative, through the gradual replacement of complex historical reality with simplified moral symbolism. The prophet Isaiah, writing in the period around the Babylonian exile, calls Cyrus the Anointed One, the Messiah, the shepherd chosen by God to accomplish divine purposes. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, Isaiah proclaims, I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I surname you, though you do not know me. A Persian king who worshipped Ahura Mazda, who had probably never heard of the Hebrew God, is described in Jewish scripture as that God's chosen instrument. The theological implications are staggering, but for our purposes what matters is the political effect. Cyrus's conquest of Babylon is sanctified, blessed, incorporated into sacred history. And Babylon's fall becomes not just a historical event, but a theological necessity, a fulfillment of prophecy, evidence that the Hebrew God controls the rise and fall of empires. This sanctification of conquest, this incorporation of Babylon's subjugation into religious narrative, represents a form of erasure more complete than any physical destruction could accomplish. Buildings can be rebuilt, populations can recover. But when a civilization's defeat becomes evidence of divine judgment, when its fall is written into sacred text as proof of cosmic justice, that civilization can never fully recover its reputation. It becomes permanently marked, permanently suspect, permanently associated with the wrong side of cosmic history. But the narrative erasure was only the beginning. Physical destruction would follow. Let us move forward 50 years to the reign of Xerxes, the Persian king known to Greeks primarily for his failed invasion of their lands, his massive army crossing the Hellespont on a bridge of boats, his defeat at Salamis and Plataea. But Xerxes' actions toward Babylon reveal another dimension of Persian policy, a dimension that contradicts the tolerant image Cyrus's cylinder projected. In 484 BCE, Babylon revolted against Persian rule. The city had chafed under foreign domination for decades. Persian kings had generally allowed Babylonian religious practices to continue, had maintained the fiction of respect for Babylonian traditions, had even participated in the New Year's festival, where the king ritually clasped the hands of Marduk's statue. But by Xerxes' time, something had changed. The details of the revolt are murky, preserved in fragmentary references and much later accounts. What we know is that Babylon rose up, that it declared independence from Persian authority, that it was suppressed with what appears to have been unprecedented violence. And then Xerxes did something that no previous conqueror had done. He destroyed the Esagila, the temple complex of Marduk, the spiritual heart of Babylonian civilization. The golden statue of Marduk, which had stood in the temple for centuries, which had been the object of New Year's rituals in which even Persian kings participated, was melted down for its gold content. Herodotus, writing a generation later, describes a statue 18 feet high, made of solid gold, sitting on a golden throne before a golden table with a golden footstool. Modern scholars debate whether Herodotus exaggerated, whether the statue was truly solid gold or merely gilded, whether all of his details can be trusted. But the core fact seems reliable. Xerxes destroyed the central cult object of Babylonian religion, removed the god from his temple, ended a tradition of worship that stretched back millennia. The religious significance of this act cannot be overstated. In Babylonian theology, the king's legitimacy derived from his relationship with Marduk. Each year, during the Akitu festival, the king would enter the temple, surrender his royal insignia to the god, receive ritual humiliation from the priests, and then be reinvested with royal authority only after proving his worthiness. The statue of Marduk was not merely a representation of the god. In Babylonian understanding, it was the god, or at least the dwelling place of the god's presence, the point where divine and human realms intersected. By destroying this statue, Xerxes was not simply committing an act of vandalism or theft. He was attempting to kill a god, to sever the connection between heaven and earth, to end the cosmic order that Babylonian civilization had maintained for thousands of years. He was saying, in the most forceful terms possible, that Babylon's god could not protect his city, that Persian power exceeded divine power, that the old order was finished forever. This is the first physical destruction, and it leaves a permanent mark. The temple would be partially rebuilt. The cult would continue in diminished form, but the golden statue was never replaced. Something had been broken that could not be mended. The spiritual center of Babylonian civilization had been violated, and the violation would be remembered, would shape how Babylonians understood their place in the world, would contribute to the gradual erosion of Babylonian identity under successive foreign rulers. Xerxes also reorganized the administration of Babylon, dividing what had been a unified satrapy into smaller units, eliminating the special status that Babylon had maintained under earlier Persian kings. The city was being demoted, reduced from the proud ancient capital of the world to merely another subject territory in an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. The Persian perspective on these events would have been different, of course. To Xerxes, the destruction of the Esagila was punishment for rebellion, a necessary demonstration of power to discourage future resistance. The Babylonians had risen up against legitimate Persian authority. They had to be punished severely to maintain order. From this perspective, the destruction was not religious persecution, but political necessity, not erasure, but discipline. But this distinction, which might seem important in the immediate context, matters less across the longer span of history. Whether Xerxes intended to destroy Babylonian civilization or merely to punish rebellion, the effect was the same. The spiritual center was broken, the special status was revoked, the slow decline accelerated, and Babylon moved another step closer to the silence that would eventually consume it entirely. Now let us move forward again to 331 BCE, to the arrival of another conqueror, one whose relationship with Babylon would be more complex and more tragic than any who came before. Alexander of Macedon, whom later ages would call the Great, entered Babylon in triumph after defeating the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela. The city that had rebelled against Xerxes now welcomed Alexander as a liberator, opening its gates without resistance, showering the young Macedonian king with the same honors once reserved for native rulers. And Alexander, unlike Xerxes, seemed to appreciate what he had conquered. The ancient sources describe him participating in Babylonian religious ceremonies, consulting with Babylonian priests, showing respect for Babylonian traditions in ways that pleased the local population. More significantly, Alexander announced plans to restore Babylon to its former glory. He ordered the rebuilding of the Itamananki, the great ziggurat that had been damaged or destroyed, setting his soldiers to work clearing the rubble that had accumulated over decades of neglect. He planned to make Babylon one of the capitals of his world empire, perhaps even the primary capital, the administrative center from which he would rule territories stretching from Greece to India. The implications of this plan, had it been fulfilled, are staggering to contemplate. Greek culture meeting Babylonian learning. Macedonian military power combined with Mesopotamian administrative tradition, the astronomical knowledge of the tablet houses joined with the philosophical traditions of Athens. Alexander's court included Greek scientists and philosophers. Babylonian priests possessed astronomical records stretching back centuries. Had these traditions been deliberately synthesized under royal patronage, the result might have transformed the entire subsequent history of human knowledge. But Alexander never completed his plans for Babylon. In 323 BCE, at the age of 32, after drinking heavily at a banquet, he fell ill with a fever. Over the following 2 weeks, his condition deteriorated. He lost the ability to speak, then the ability to move. His generals gathered around his bed, asking to whom he left his empire. His final word, and according to some accounts, was Kratisto, to the strongest. Then he died. The timing has always seemed suspicious to those inclined toward conspiracy. Alexander died in Babylon, the very city he planned to elevate, before his restoration projects could be completed. Ancient sources record rumors of poisoning, of plots among his generals, of resentments that had built over years of campaigning. Modern historians generally attribute his death to fever, perhaps typhoid or malaria, complicated by his heavy drinking and the accumulated wounds from years of battle. The truth may never be known with certainty. What is certain is that Alexander's death ended any chance of Babylon's restoration. His empire fragmented immediately, his generals dividing the territories among themselves, fighting civil wars that would continue for decades. Babylon itself became a prize contested by competing factions, changing hands multiple times in the wars of succession. And when the dust settled, when Seleucus emerged as the ruler of Babylon and the Eastern Territories, he made a decision that would seal the city's fate. He built a new capital. Seleucia on the Tigris, founded around 305 BCE, was designed from the start to replace Babylon. Seleucus and his successors moved populations, temples, and administrative functions from the ancient city to the new one. The process was gradual but deliberate. Babylon was not destroyed. It was made irrelevant. This represents a different kind of erasure than either Cyrus's narrative transformation or Xerxes's violent destruction. The Seleucids did not need to tear down Babylon's walls or burn its temples. They simply built something new and drew away the life force of the old city through administrative decision. If you want to cross the Tigris, go to Seleucia. If you want to petition the king, go to Seleucia. If you want to trade in the major markets, go to Seleucia. If you want your children to learn Greek and participate in Hellenistic culture, go to Seleucia. Year by year, decade by decade, the population drained away. The temples emptied. The tablet houses continued their work, but with fewer students, fewer patrons, less connection to living power structures. The astronomical diaries continued to be written, maintained by priests who understood their importance even as the city crumbled around them. The last dated cuneiform tablet we possess was written in 75 CE, an astronomical diary recording celestial observations with the same precision that Babylonian scribes had maintained for centuries. By then, the city was essentially abandoned, a ruin haunted by a handful of priests still maintaining traditions that no one else remembered or cared about. The quiet persistence of those final scribes is perhaps the most poignant detail in this entire story. They knew their civilization was dying. They knew the Greeks considered their knowledge barbaric, their language obsolete, their gods superseded. But they continued writing, continued observing, continued pressing their wedge-shaped marks into clay long after anyone outside their small circle could read them. They were preserving for a future that might never come, trusting that someday, somehow, someone would find their tablets and understand. And we did find them. 2,000 years later, we deciphered their script and read their observations and marveled at their precision. But in the meantime, Babylon fell silent, and the knowledge those scribes preserved was lost to human memory, surviving only in museums and excavation sites, waiting through centuries of forgetting for the patient work of archaeology to bring it back to light. The Seleucid period also saw something else important for our story: the transmission of Babylonian knowledge into Greek frameworks. Berossus, a Babylonian priest, wrote a history of Babylon in Greek around 290 BCE, attempting to explain his civilization to its new rulers. His work, the Babyloniaca, summarized millennia of historical and astronomical knowledge for a Greek-speaking audience. Most of it is lost, surviving only in fragments quoted by later authors. But what remains shows a sophisticated attempt at cultural translation. Greek astronomers adopted Babylonian methods and observations, often without acknowledgement. The zodiac, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, the system of hours and minutes, these Babylonian innovations passed into Greek usage and from there into the common heritage of humanity. But the transfer was incomplete, selective, filtered through Greek assumptions and priorities. What the Greeks found useful, they kept. What they considered superstitious or barbaric, they discarded or ignored. The omen literature, the magical texts, the theological frameworks that gave Babylonian knowledge its meaning and context, these were largely abandoned. The techniques were preserved. The worldview was lost. This selective transmission represents yet another form of erasure, perhaps the subtlest and most effective of all. The knowledge survives, but stripped of its context, its meaning transformed, its origins forgotten or dismissed. We still use Babylonian mathematics every time we check our watches or measure an angle. But we do not think of this as Babylonian knowledge. We think of it as simply knowledge, as obvious truths that any civilization might have discovered. The Babylonian contribution is invisible, erased not through destruction, but through absorption, through the seamless incorporation of their insights into frameworks that claim no debt to them. Now we must turn to the most influential erasure of all, the transformation of Babylon in Hebrew scripture, and the construction of the city as cosmic enemy that would shape how billions of subsequent humans understood this civilization. The Jewish experience of Babylon was unique among ancient peoples. Other nations were conquered by Babylon, subjected to its rule, required to pay tribute. But the Jews of Judah experienced something more traumatic, something that would mark their religious consciousness forever. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem, razed the temple that Solomon had built, and deported much of the surviving population to Babylon itself. This was not simply conquest. This was theological catastrophe. The temple was not just a building. It was the dwelling place of God, the point where heaven and earth connected, the center of Jewish religious life. Its destruction raised questions that threatened to shatter Jewish faith entirely. Had God abandoned his people? Was God weaker than Marduk? Had the covenant failed? The theological response to these questions shaped Judaism and, through Judaism, Christianity and Islam, and the entire moral framework of Western civilization. The prophets declared that Jerusalem's destruction was not evidence of God's weakness, but of God's judgment. Israel had sinned, had broken the covenant, had worshipped foreign gods and oppressed the poor and ignored the prophets' warnings. God used Babylon as his instrument of punishment, his rod of anger, his tool for disciplining his wayward people. This interpretation saved the Jewish faith from collapse. If God had sent Babylon as punishment, then God remained in control. And the destruction meant not divine impotence, but divine sovereignty. And if God had punished Israel for its sins, then repentance could bring restoration. Hope remained possible. But this theological solution came at a cost, or rather, it imposed a cost on Babylon. For the equation to work, for Jerusalem's destruction to be meaningful punishment rather than random tragedy, Babylon had to be evil. Not just politically aggressive, not just militarily powerful, but morally corrupt, spiritually bankrupt, cosmically opposed to everything God represented. And so the Hebrew scriptures construct Babylon as precisely that. The Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11 is not simply about a building project. Read in its ancient context, it is a polemic against Babylonian civilization, a deliberate inversion of Babylonian values and claims. The Hebrew name Babel is a pun. In Akkadian, Babylon means Gate of the Gods, a proud title celebrating the city as the point of connection between divine and human realms. But in Hebrew, the word sounds like Balal to confuse, and the story transforms the proud meaning into shameful absurdity. The Babylonians built their great ziggurats to reach heaven, to establish connection with the divine, and they claimed this connection gave them wisdom and power and legitimacy. The Genesis story says God came down to see their pathetic little tower, laughed at their pretension, confused their languages, and scattered them across the earth. Their great achievement was divine judgment. Their proud civilization was cosmic failure. The pattern of inversion continues throughout Hebrew scripture. A Babylonian creation mythology celebrated Marduk's victory over the chaos monster Tiamat, his organization of the cosmos, his establishment of order and civilization with Babylon at its center. Hebrew creation theology rejected all of this. The God of Israel created alone, without struggle, through mere speech. The waters were not a chaos monster to be conquered, but simply material to be ordered. And the center of creation was not Babylon, but Eden, not the Euphrates, but a garden, not human civilization, but divine intention. Every Babylonian claim was systematically negated. Every Babylonian pride was deliberately humbled. Every Babylonian achievement was reinterpreted as failure or sin or judgment. The prophetic literature intensifies this construction. Isaiah chapters 13 and 14 pronounce doom on Babylon in terms of cosmic destruction. Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. Arabs will not pitch their tents there. Shepherds will not make their flocks lie down there. But wild animals will lie down there, and its houses will be full of howling creatures. These prophecies, written partly before and partly after Babylon's actual fall, create a framework where the city's destruction is inevitable, deserved, cosmically required. They transform historical contingency into theological necessity. Babylon must fall because God has decreed it. Babylon must fall because its sins demand judgment. Babylon must fall because its existence is an offense against divine order. And when Babylon did fall, when Cyrus conquered the city without a battle, the prophecies seemed validated. God had spoken, and history had obeyed. The pattern was established, the interpretation confirmed. The construction of Babylon as evil was sealed with the authority of fulfilled prophecy. But the biblical construction did not stop with the prophets. It continued through the Christian period, taking on new dimensions in the apocalyptic literature of the New Testament. The book of Revelation, written in the late 1st century CE, uses Babylon as a cipher for Rome, but in doing so, transforms the ancient city into an eternal symbol of worldly corruption and divine judgment. Chapters 17 and 18 describe the great whore who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. She is called Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations, and she holds a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. The imagery is deliberately shocking, sexualized, designed to provoke disgust and moral condemnation. And it worked. For 2,000 years, the name Babylon has carried these associations, has evoked not the astronomical observatories and the legal codes and the magnificent architecture, but the whore and the cup and the abominations. The ancient city of learning and innovation was transformed into the eternal symbol of corruption and divine judgment. This is the most complete erasure of all, more thorough than any physical destruction could accomplish. Xerxes melted the statue of Marduk. On But Babylonians could have made another statue. The Seleucids drained Babylon's population, but cities can be repopulated. But Revelation made Babylon a permanent category of evil, a word that would be used for millennia to condemn whatever the speaker opposed, a symbol so powerful that the historical reality behind it became almost impossible to see. Consider how completely this construction has succeeded. Say the name Babylon to almost anyone formed by Western culture, and what images come to mind? Decadence, excess, corruption, the fall, the judgment, the whore. These associations are so deeply embedded that we barely notice them, so thoroughly internalized that they seem like simple truth rather than constructed interpretation. We have to make a conscious effort to remember that Babylon was also the place where astronomy was invented, where law was codified, where mathematics achieved sophistication that Europe would not match for 2,000 years. The other meanings have been erased, or rather buried so deeply beneath the biblical construction that retrieving them requires archaeological effort, requires digging through layers of accumulated condemnation to find the reality beneath. And the power of the metaphor continues. Rastafarian theology identifies Babylon with Western imperialism and oppression, the system of exploitation that has persecuted the righteous. Political rhetoric uses Babylon to condemn whatever the speaker considers corrupt or decadent. The word has become a weapon, a condemnation, a way of marking enemies as cosmically evil. When we call something Babylonian, we are not making a neutral historical reference. We are invoking thousands of years of constructed meaning, participating in an erasure that began with the Judean exiles and continues in our own speech. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Babylon's fate. Physical destruction is temporary. Populations recover. Buildings can be rebuilt. But narrative destruction, the transformation of a civilization's meaning, the capture and redirection of how it is remembered, this can persist indefinitely, can shape consciousness for millennia, can become so thoroughly embedded in culture that we no longer recognize it as interpretation. The Persians told the first story that Babylon deserved to fall because even its own god rejected it. The Seleucids enacted the second story that Babylon was irrelevant, that the future belonged to Greek culture and Greek cities. But the Jews and Christians told the final story that Babylon was evil, that its fall was cosmic necessity, that its name should be forever associated with corruption and judgment and the wrath of God. And their story won. Their story became the framework through which the entire Western world understood this ancient civilization. Their story erased everything else, buried the astronomy and the mathematics and the law beneath layers of moral condemnation so thick that even now, even after 2 centuries of archaeology and scholarship, we struggle to see Babylon clearly, to see it as it was, rather than as the biblical construction taught us to see it. This is the power of narrative. This is why stories matter. This is why control of memory is often more important than control of territory. The Babylonians are gone, have been gone for 2,000 years. But their killers, if we can use that word for those who erased them from human memory, their killers continue to shape how we think about them. Every time we use Babylon as a symbol of corruption, we participate in that erasure. Every time we forget that we are using a construct rather than describing a reality, we complete what Cyrus and Xerxes and the prophets and John of Patmos began. The tablets wait in their museum cases, patient, hoping that someday we will read them with fresh eyes, will see through the constructed meaning to the human achievement beneath. We'll remember that before Babylon was a symbol, it was a city. Before it was a metaphor, it was a place where people lived and loved and wondered at the stars. They have waited a long time. They can wait longer. Here is something strange to consider as you lie there in the darkness, something that doesn't quite add up when you examine the fates of ancient civilizations. Egypt was conquered by the Persians, by the Greeks, by the Romans, by the Arabs, and yet Egyptian culture survived every conquest. The pyramids still stand. The temples still draw visitors from around the world. The hieroglyphics were forgotten for over 1,000 years. Yes, but when Jean-François Champollion cracked the code using the Rosetta Stone in 1822, the world celebrated. Museums rushed to acquire Egyptian artifacts. Universities established Egyptology departments. The Egyptian past became a source of wonder, of pride, of endless fascination. No one suggested that Egyptian knowledge was dangerous, or that their religious texts should be suppressed, or that their mathematical achievements should be attributed to someone else. Egypt was conquered, but Egypt was also honored. Greece was absorbed into the Roman Empire, and yet Greek philosophy not only survived, but became the foundation of Western thought. Plato and Aristotle were never forgotten. Their works were copied and recopied through the medieval period, studied in monasteries, translated into Arabic and then back into Latin, treated as the pinnacle of human wisdom. Greek mathematics, Greek astronomy, Greek medicine, all of it preserved, celebrated, built upon. The conquering Romans didn't try to erase Greek culture. They adopted it, elevated it, spread it across their empire. Now, to be educated in Rome meant to be educated in Greek thought. The cultural continuity stretched unbroken from ancient Athens to the Renaissance, to the modern university, where students still read the same texts that Socrates debated in the Agora. Rome itself fell, collapsed under the weight of invasion and eternal decay. And yet Roman law lives on in every legal system descended from European tradition. The Latin language survived in the Catholic Church, in scientific nomenclature, in the Romance languages spoken by hundreds of millions today. Roman engineering principles still inform how we build roads and aqueducts and arches. The Roman past was never erased. It was revered, studied, imitated, claimed as heritage by every subsequent European civilization. The Holy Roman Empire took its name from that legacy. The Renaissance was explicitly an attempt to recover and continue Roman and Greek greatness. America's founding fathers modeled their republic on Roman precedents, built their capital with Roman columns, named their legislative body the Senate. Continuity, preservation, honor, but Babylon. Babylon the Magnificent, Babylon the Learned, Babylon that gave humanity the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle and the 7-day week. Babylon, whose astronomers tracked the movements of planets for centuries with precision that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the telescope. Babylon, whose mathematicians solved quadratic equations while Greece was still in its dark age. Babylon, whose legal codes predated Moses by 1,000 years. Babylon, whose libraries held more accumulated knowledge than any institution of the ancient world. This civilization was not preserved. It was not honored. It was not built upon by those who came after. It was erased so completely that for nearly 2,000 years, No living person could read a single word of what the Babylonians had written. The cuneiform script that had served as the writing system for Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and a dozen other languages. The script that had recorded everything from grocery lists to star catalogues to epic poetry for over 3 millennia, this script simply died. The last person who could read it died sometime around the 1st century of the Common Era. And then silence. 2,000 years of silence while the tablets lay buried in the Iraqi sand, and their wedge-shaped marks meaningless to anyone who stumbled upon them. This is not normal. This is not what happens when civilizations are merely conquered or absorbed or allowed to fade naturally. This is erasure on a scale that demands explanation. Consider the Hittites. For most of recorded history, the Hittites were mentioned only in passing in the Hebrew Bible, and scholars assumed they were a minor tribe somewhere in Canaan. Then, in the 19th century, archaeologists began uncovering ruins in central Turkey that told a completely different story. A massive empire that had rivaled Egypt, that had fought Ramesses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, that had developed iron smelting technology that gave them military advantages over their Bronze Age neighbors. An entire civilization with its own language, its own legal system, its own rich mythology, completely forgotten for over 3,000 years. The Hittites were erased not through deliberate destruction, but through the simple mechanism of being absorbed by successor peoples who had no interest in preserving their memory. Their language wasn't passed on. Their stories weren't retold. They became a footnote in someone else's scripture, stripped of context and significance. Consider Carthage. Here the erasure was deliberate, systematic, and proud. Rome fought 3 wars against Carthage across more than a century, and in the 3rd, they decided to end the threat permanently. The Roman senator Cato the Elder ended every speech in the Senate with the same phrase regardless of the topic being discussed: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And in 146 BCE, Rome made good on that imperative. They breached the walls after a 3-year siege. They fought street by street through the city. They killed the defenders or sold them into slavery. They burned the buildings. They tore down the walls. And then, according to later traditions that may be more symbolic than literal, they salted the earth so nothing would grow there again. The destruction of Carthage was not incidental. It was policy. Rome wanted Carthage not merely defeated, but obliterated, removed from the possibility of future competition. And it worked. Carthaginian civilization left almost no direct trace. We know of their achievements primarily through Greek and Roman sources, which is to say through the accounts of their enemies and rivals, their own records, their own perspectives, their own stories, mostly gone. What survives is fragmented, filtered through hostile interpreters, the losers' history written by the winners who destroyed them. Consider the Minoans, that mysterious civilization of Bronze Age Crete, whose palace at Knossos amazed archaeologists when Arthur Evans began excavating in 1900. Beautiful frescoes of dolphins and dancers, sophisticated plumbing systems, a writing system called Linear A that remains undeciphered to this day. We cannot read a single word the Minoans wrote. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their gods' names or their kings' names or the stories they told their children. The Minoan civilization collapsed around 1450 BCE, possibly due to volcanic eruption, possibly due to invasion from mainland Greece, possibly due to some combination of catastrophes. Whatever happened, the Minoans passed out of history so completely that even the Greeks who settled Crete afterward preserved only the vaguest legends about King Minos and his labyrinth and the monster at its heart. 3,500 years later, we can walk through their ruined palaces and look at their art and wonder what they believed, what they knew, what they dreamed. But we cannot know. The erasure is complete on the level of meaning. What determines whether a civilization is remembered or forgotten, preserved or erased, honored or demonized? The obvious answer is power. The winners write history, as the cliché goes, and there is truth in that. Egypt survived because Egypt was too magnificent to destroy and too useful to ignore. The Greeks who conquered Egypt under Alexander made themselves pharaohs. The Romans who came after continued the tradition. The knowledge Egypt held, astronomical, architectural, medical, was too valuable to suppress. Better to claim it, to absorb it, to present it as heritage rather than threat. Greece survived because Greek culture conquered Rome more thoroughly than Roman legions conquered Greece. By the time Rome dominated the Mediterranean, educated Romans spoke Greek, read Greek philosophy, adopted Greek gods under Latin names. To destroy Greek culture would have been to destroy the intellectual foundation of the Roman elite itself. So Greek culture was preserved, protected, funded. The Ptolemies built the great library at Alexandria to collect all the world's knowledge, and Greek knowledge was always at the core. Rome survived because Christianity claimed it. When the Western Empire fell, the Church remained. The bishops of Rome became the popes, spiritual heirs to an imperial tradition. The Church conducted its business in Latin, preserved Roman texts in monastery scriptoria, maintained Roman institutional structures even as the political empire crumbled. There was continuity because powerful institutions had reason to maintain continuity, because preserving the Roman past served the interests of those who inherited Roman power. But Babylon had no heirs with interest in preservation. The Persians who conquered Babylon in 539 BCE were already monotheists, followers of Zoroaster who worshipped Ahura Mazda and saw Babylonian religion as something to be tolerated at best, suppressed at worst. The Greeks who came after Alexander saw Babylon as barbaric, impressive in its engineering perhaps, but philosophically primitive, are unworthy of serious engagement. The Romans never controlled Mesopotamia for long enough to absorb its traditions. And then came the great monotheistic wave that swept the Near East, first Christianity and then Islam, and Babylonian religion with its many gods and its astral worship and its deep integration of divination into daily life became not just obsolete, but actively offensive, a remnant of Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, something to be abandoned rather than preserved. There was no one left who had reason to remember Babylon well. The Jews remembered Babylon as their captor, the destroyer of the temple, the place of exile and weeping by the waters. Christians inherited that memory and amplified it, making Babylon the very symbol of worldly corruption and divine judgment. Muslims built their caliphates on Mesopotamian soil but felt no connection to the pagan past buried beneath their feet. For 2,000 years, everyone who lived in the region had religious reasons to forget what had come before, to let the sands cover the ruins, to leave the tablets unread. and so Babylon was erased. Not in a single act of destruction like Carthage, though there were destructions. Not through natural catastrophe like the Minoans, though there were catastrophes. But through something more comprehensive, a systematic stripping away of context and continuity until all that remained was the name, and the name had become a curse. And then, impossibly, the erasure began to reverse. In the early 19th century, European travelers and diplomats in the Ottoman Empire began noticing strange inscriptions carved into cliffs and stamped into clay bricks at ancient ruins throughout Mesopotamia. The marks looked like nothing they had seen, triangular wedge shapes pressed into stone or clay in complex patterns, clearly writing of some kind but utterly unreadable. This was cuneiform, the oldest writing system in the world, dead for 18 centuries, waiting to speak again if only someone could learn to listen. The man who learned to listen was Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer stationed in Persia in the 1830s. Near the town of Bisitun in western Iran, high on a cliff face, was a massive inscription carved into the rock by order of the Persian king Darius the Great around 520 BCE. And the inscription celebrated Darius's victories and justified his claim to the throne. And, crucially, it was written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Rawlinson realized that this trilingual inscription might serve the same function as the Rosetta Stone had for Egyptian hieroglyphics. If he could decipher one of the languages, he might use it to crack the others. Between 1835 and 1846, Rawlinson climbed the cliff face repeatedly, sometimes dangling from ropes hundreds of feet above the ground, making copies of the inscriptions. He worked on the Old Persian first, which was the most recent and had some connection to languages still spoken. Slowly, painfully, through brilliant guesswork and systematic analysis, he began to read. The Old Persian led to the Babylonian. The Babylonian unlocked the entire cuneiform tradition. After 2,000 years of silence, the tablets could speak again. What came flooding back when we could read again staggers the imagination. In the 1840s and 1850s, while Rawlinson was still working on his decipherments, Austin Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital north of Babylon. He uncovered the palace of the Assyrian king Sennacherib and the great library of Ashurbanipal, that same library we encountered at the beginning of our journey, the one that burned when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE and was accidentally preserved by the very flames meant to destroy it. The British Museum began receiving shipments of clay tablets by the thousands. Most were administrative records, temple inventories, royal correspondence, and in the mundane paperwork of an ancient bureaucracy. But some were different. Some contained literature, mythology, science, history. And on a winter day in 1872, a self-taught genius named George Smith was sorting through tablets in the British Museum basement when he realized what he was reading. His hands began to shake. According to witnesses, he became so excited that he began removing his clothes, pacing frantically around the room, overcome by the significance of his discovery. What George Smith had found was the flood story. Not Noah's flood, not yet. An older flood, a Babylonian flood, preserved on tablets that predated the earliest books of the Bible by at least 1,000 years. A man warned by a god that destruction is coming. Instructions to build a boat. Animals brought aboard. The waters rising. days of devastation. A mountain landing, a bird sent out to find dry land, a sacrifice offered afterward, a promise from the gods. The parallels with Genesis were undeniable and unmistakable. Here was evidence that the biblical flood story had roots far older than Moses, far older than the supposed revelation at Sinai. The Babylonians had told this story first, and somehow, through channels we can only partially reconstruct, it had passed into the Hebrew tradition, and from there into sacred scripture read by billions. The discovery of the flood tablet was just the beginning. As more texts were translated, more parallels emerged. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that masterpiece of world literature that had been completely unknown for 2 millennia, contained not only the flood story, but resonances with biblical themes throughout. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the wild man created by the gods, the quest for immortality, the serpent who steals the plant of eternal life, the wisdom that death is inevitable and life must be lived fully in the time allotted. Themes that echo in Ecclesiastes, in Job, in the prophetic literature. Then came the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the primordial waters, the separation of the waters above from the waters below, the creation of humanity from divine substance mixed with earthly clay, the sequence of creation. The rest of the Creator God after the work is complete. Again, parallels with Genesis that could not be coincidental. The Hebrew writers had known these stories. They had adapted them, transformed them, given them new theological meaning. But they had not invented them from nothing. They had inherited them from the very civilization they condemned as the epitome of corruption. The theological implications were profound and profoundly troubling to 19th century believers. If the flood story was Babylonian before it was biblical, what did that mean for biblical authority? If the creation account echoed Mesopotamian mythology, was Genesis merely another myth among myths? Churches and universities struggled with these questions. Some scholars attempted to suppress the findings or minimize their significance. Others embraced them, arguing that the parallels actually strengthened biblical credibility by showing that ancient traditions preserved genuine historical memories. The debate continues to this day, more than a century and a half later, in seminary classrooms and academic journals and late-night conversations about the nature of Scripture and revelation. But what cannot be denied, what the tablets proved beyond any reasonable doubt, is that Babylon came first. The legal codes we found, the Code of Hammurabi and others like it, predated the laws of Moses by centuries. The mathematical knowledge we uncovered, the astronomical observations, the medical treatises, all of it was older than Greece, older than anything we had imagined possible for such an ancient time. The Babylonians had been sophisticated when our ancestors were barbarians. They had built cities when Europeans lived in huts. They had tracked the movements of planets for generations while we were still struggling to survive winter. And somehow, through processes we are only beginning to understand, that knowledge had been transmitted, transformed, and in many cases claimed as original by the cultures that received it. What remains untranslated should haunt us. There are hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets in museums around the world, and the vast majority have never been fully studied. They sit in storage rooms and basement archives, numbered and catalogued, but unread. We simply don't have enough scholars who can read these ancient scripts, and we don't fund the slow, painstaking work of translation that would be required to process everything we've already found. Meanwhile, new tablets continue to emerge, many through the antiquities black market, stripped of archaeological context. Their significance diminished because we don't know where they came from or what other tablets they were found with. We have recovered an enormous amount of Babylonian knowledge, but we have barely begun to understand it all. And what we might have recovered if the erasure had been less complete, what was lost in the fires and the floods and the simple neglect of centuries, we will never know. The gaps in our knowledge are permanent. The tablets that crumbled to dust before anyone could read them are gone forever. The oral traditions that were never written down died with the last speakers of Babylonian. The architectural knowledge encoded in buildings that have collapsed into unreadable rubble is unrecoverable. What we have is a fraction, a precious, miraculous fraction that survived against all odds, but a fraction nonetheless. And the destruction continues. In the 20th century, Babylon became a political symbol once again. Saddam Hussein, this dictator of Iraq from 1979 to 2003, fancied himself a new Nebuchadnezzar. He launched reconstruction projects at the ancient site, rebuilding walls and palaces atop the ruins. His workers inscribed new bricks with his name, just as Nebuchadnezzar had inscribed his own name 26 centuries earlier. A palace for Saddam was built on an artificial hill overlooking the archaeological site. Babylon became a propaganda tool, a way for Saddam to connect his regime to ancient Mesopotamian glory. Archaeologists were horrified. The reconstruction work was shoddy, historically inaccurate, damaging to the actual ruins beneath. But Saddam controlled the site, and his vision prevailed. Then came the Gulf War of 1991, and the Iraq War of 2003, and the American occupation. And something happened that should trouble anyone who cares about the preservation of human heritage. In April 2003, as Baghdad fell to coalition forces, the Iraq Museum was looted. Thousands of artifacts were stolen, many of them cuneiform tablets, scattered onto the international antiquities market, where provenance is lost and context destroyed. The losses were catastrophic, though somewhat less severe than initially feared, as many objects were later recovered. But worse was to come. Between 2003 and 2004, the United States military established a base at Babylon itself. Camp Alpha housed up to 2,000 troops on the grounds of one of the most important archaeological sites in human history. Military vehicles drove over ruins that had survived 25 centuries. Helicopter landing pads were constructed on archaeological deposits. Trenches were dug through stratified remains. Sandbags were filled with soil containing pottery fragments and other artifacts. The damage was documented by subsequent investigations and acknowledged by the US military, which issued an apology of sorts. But the damage was done. Layers of history that had survived the Persians and the Greeks and the Seleucids and 2,000 years of neglect were disturbed or destroyed in a matter of months. The erasure continued. Different methods, different motives, but the same result. More knowledge lost, more context destroyed, more gaps in our understanding of what Babylon was and what it knew. Why does this matter? Why should you, lying there in the darkness of your own time and place, you care about the destruction of a city that fell 2,500 years ago, and the ongoing loss of artifacts that most people will never see or read? Because the pattern matters. Because what happened to Babylon has happened before and is happening still and will happen again unless we recognize it for what it is. Babylon represented something. Not just a city, not just an empire, but a way of knowing, a system of understanding the world that was fundamentally different from what came after. The Babylonians saw the universe as a place of patterns and cycles, of divine forces acting through natural phenomena, of knowledge accessible through observation and calculation, and yes, through divination and astrology and practices we now dismiss as superstition. But within that framework, they achieved things that still astonish us. They predicted eclipses. They tracked planetary movements. They developed mathematical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. They built a civilization that lasted in various forms for over 3,000 years, longer than any culture that exists today. And then they were erased, not because they failed, not because their knowledge was useless, but because their knowledge was threatening. Threatening to the Persians who needed to justify their conquest. Threatening to the Greeks who wanted to believe they had invented philosophy and science. Threatening to the monotheistic religions that could not tolerate the suggestion that divine truth might have multiple sources, that wisdom might come from pagan priests as well as prophets, that the biblical narrative might be one version among many rather than the singular revelation of the one true God. The erasure of Babylon was not an accident of history. It was a pattern, a repeating pattern that occurs whenever one system of knowledge becomes powerful enough to suppress its rivals. We see it in the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems by colonial powers. We see it in the burning of libraries and the persecution of scholars who challenge orthodox positions. We see it in the way certain questions become unspeakable, certain possibilities unthinkable, certain traditions unmemorable. The winners write history, yes. But more than that, the winners determine what counts as knowledge, what is worth preserving, what deserves to be remembered and studied and built upon. The losers are not just defeated. They are forgotten. Their wisdom is dismissed as superstition. Their achievements are attributed to others. Their very existence fades from memory until archaeologists dig them up and scholars struggle to reconstruct what was lost. Are we still erasing? Consider what knowledge systems are currently being destroyed. Indigenous languages dying at the rate of one every few weeks, each language carrying unique ways of understanding and categorizing the world, ecological knowledge accumulated over millennia, stories and songs and wisdom that will never be recovered once the last speaker dies. Traditional practices dismissed as primitive by development agencies and governments eager to modernize, replaced by systems that may be more efficient in the short term, but lose something irreplaceable in the transition. Scientific research suppressed because it threatens corporate interests or political ideologies. Historical narratives simplified to serve national myths, complexity flattened into propaganda, inconvenient facts quietly forgotten. The mechanisms of erasure are not always dramatic. They don't require burning libraries or salting fields. They work through neglect, through defunding, through the slow marginalization of knowledge that doesn't serve power, through the quiet assumption that what we know now is all that matters, and what they knew then was merely a primitive precursor to our own magnificent understanding. But the Babylonians knew things we don't know. They understood their world in ways we have lost the capacity to understand. Their astronomical observations, I conducted over centuries with nothing but naked eyes and careful record-keeping, achieved precision that we only matched with telescopes and mathematics, developed 2,000 years later. What else did they know that we've forgotten to ask about? What questions did they answer that we've forgotten to ask? What wisdom is still buried in those unread tablets in museum basements, waiting for scholars who may never come, funding that may never be allocated, attention that may never be paid? The pattern is visible across time if you know how to look. Civilizations rise. They accumulate knowledge. They build institutions to preserve and transmit that knowledge. And then they fall, and sometimes the knowledge survives the fall, and sometimes it doesn't. And the difference between survival and erasure often has less to do with the value of the knowledge than with the interests of those who come after. Babylon fell, and what Babylon knew was largely erased. And for 2,000 years, the world continued without it. And most people never noticed the loss, because you can't miss what you don't know existed. But the loss was real. The astronomical knowledge, the mathematical techniques, the literary traditions, the legal innovations, all of it had to be rediscovered or was lost forever. And the centuries it took to rediscover what had been known added centuries to human suffering and ignorance that might have been avoided if the chain of transmission had not been broken. This is what erasure costs. Not just the loss of old things, old tablets, old stories, old buildings, but the delay of new things, new discoveries, new understanding, because we have to reinvent what our ancestors already knew rather than building on their foundations. Every time a knowledge system is erased, humanity starts over from further back than it needs to. Every time a library burns, or a language dies, or a tradition is suppressed, we lose not just the past, but a portion of the future that might have grown from it. Let that thought settle as you drift. The tablets still wait. In London and Berlin and Paris and Baghdad and 100 other cities, the clay fragments rest in their cases and their drawers, patient as they have been patient for millennia. Some will be read. Most will not. Not in our lifetimes. Perhaps not ever. The scholars who can read cuneiform are few. And there is more material than they could process in 1,000 years of continuous work. The funding is inadequate. The interest is limited. Other priorities compete for attention. And so the tablets wait, holding knowledge we may never recover, answers to questions we may never think to ask. But they exist. They survived. Against all odds, through fires and floods and deliberate destruction and 2,000 years of forgetting, some portion of what Babylon knew has come down to us. It is fragmentary. It is incomplete. It raises as many questions as it answers. But it is something. It is proof that erasure is never total, that knowledge has a stubborn tendency to survive its suppressors. The truth buried in the ground can be dug up by those who come after. And perhaps that is the most important thing to take from Babylon's story, as sleep pulls you down into its depths. Erasure is never total. Forgetting is never complete. What is hidden can be found. What is silenced can speak again. The tablets waited 2,000 years. They can wait longer. But we don't have to make them wait. We can choose to read them. We can choose to fund the scholarship. We can choose to remember what was forgotten. We can choose to learn from civilizations we once dismissed as primitive or corrupt or merely irrelevant. The choice is ours. It has always been ours. And in making it or failing to make it, we determine not just what we know about the past, but what we might become in the future. But now we have traced the pattern across 2.5 millennia, and perhaps it is time to step back and see what the pattern reveals when viewed from sufficient distance. The erasure of Babylon was not a single event, but a process, a layered destruction that accumulated over centuries like sediment depositing in a river delta, each layer obscuring what came before while adding its own weight to the burial. First came the Persians under Cyrus, who conquered with propaganda rather than pure force, who rewrote the narrative so thoroughly that Babylon's own god Marduk was made to welcome foreign conquest, who began the long process of transforming a living civilization into a symbol of decadence deserving its fate. Then came Xerxes with fire and molten gold, melting the great statue of Marduk, dismantling the temples, punishing Babylon for daring to remember that it had once been sovereign. Then came Alexander, who alone among the conquerors seemed to recognize what Babylon truly was, who planned to restore and expand rather than diminish, who died mysteriously in the very city he sought to resurrect before his vision could take root. Then came the Seleucids, who accomplished through neglect what warfare had failed to complete, draining Babylon of its population to fill their new Greek city, letting the canals silt up, letting the temples crumble, making Babylon irrelevant rather than destroying it outright. Then came the biblical tradition, which transformed a physical city into a cosmic enemy, which made Babylon the eternal symbol of human pride and divine punishment, which ensured that even after the cuneiform was deciphered and the tablets began to speak again, the name Babylon would carry weight of condemnation across every culture touched by Abrahamic religion. And finally came the modern destruction, the military base on sacred ground, the looters tearing through tells for sellable antiquities, the ongoing loss of tablets to the black market where context dies and knowledge becomes commodity. Layer upon layer upon layer, physical destruction and narrative destruction and metaphorical destruction, until the greatest city of the ancient world became a mound in the Iraqi desert that most people could not find on a map. The question that emerges from this pattern is whether we are looking at coincidence or coordination, at accident or intention, at the random accumulation of historical forces or something more deliberate. The careful scholar says coincidence, says that empires rise and fall, that cities are abandoned, that cultural memories fade naturally over time, that there is no conspiracy required to explain why a Bronze Age civilization eventually disappeared from living memory. And the careful scholar is probably correct, at least in the narrow sense that no secret society met across the centuries to plan Babylon's erasure. No coordinated campaign spanned Persian and Greek and Roman and Christian authorities with a shared agenda. But intention does not require coordination. Patterns do not require conspiracy. Each successive power had its own reasons for diminishing Babylon, for burying its knowledge, for replacing its narratives with their own, and the cumulative effect of all those individual decisions, each rationale within its own context, was the near total erasure of the civilization that had given the world mathematics and astronomy and written law. The Persians needed Babylon discredited to justify their conquest. The Greeks needed Babylon primitive to justify their claims of cultural superiority. The Romans needed Babylon distant and decadent to serve as cautionary tale. The biblical tradition needed Babylon demonic, to serve as theological counterpoint to Jerusalem. Each empire, each religion, each rising power found Babylon useful only as a symbol of what they were not, what they had surpassed, what they had righteously replaced. And so, without coordination, without conspiracy, through the simple accumulation of self-interested narrative construction, Babylon was erased not once, but continuously, each generation adding its layer to the burial, each telling of the story pushing the reality further from view. What was it about Babylon that made it so threatening, so necessary to diminish, so useful as a negative example across such different cultures and centuries? Perhaps the answer lies in what Babylon represented before it became a symbol. Before the fall, before the prophetic condemnations, before the metaphor solidified into eternal hostility, Babylon was something unprecedented in human history. The first truly international intellectual capital, a city where knowledge from across the known world accumulated and synthesized and developed into systems of unprecedented sophistication. Egyptian astronomy contributed to Babylonian star catalogues. The Indian mathematics may have influenced Babylonian calculation methods. Trade networks spanning from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley brought not just goods, but ideas. And Babylon sat at the center of those networks, absorbing and transforming and disseminating. This was threatening, not because it was foreign, but because it was universal, because it claimed authority not through blood or tribe or chosen people, but through accumulated wisdom accessible to anyone who would learn. A priest in Babylon could predict eclipses, not because his god was more powerful, but because generations of observers had recorded data and identified patterns and refined calculations until prediction became possible. A judge in Babylon could render verdicts not based on tribal custom, but based on written law that applied to native and foreigner alike. A physician in Babylon could treat illness not through exorcism alone, but through careful observation of symptoms and systematic testing of treatments. This was a different kind of power than the power of empire or the power of prophecy. This was the power of knowledge systematically accumulated and rationally applied, and every subsequent authority that claimed legitimacy through revelation rather than observation, through divine right rather than demonstrated competence, through tribal identity rather than universal principles, had reason to view Babylonian precedent with suspicion. Consider for a moment what the world might look like if Babylon had survived. If Alexander had lived to complete his restoration, if the Seleucids had maintained rather than abandoned the city, if the cuneiform tradition had continued unbroken into the classical period and beyond. This is speculation, of course, alternative history rather than analysis, but the speculation illuminates what was lost. Imagine Greek philosophy developing in direct dialogue with Babylonian astronomical mathematics, rather than reconstructing both from fragments and rumors. Imagine Roman law building explicitly on Hammurabi's code, rather than reinventing legal principles from scratch. Imagine medieval Europe inheriting directly the astronomical observations that Babylonian priests had accumulated over centuries, rather than waiting for Arabic translations of Greek approximations of Babylonian originals. Imagine monotheistic traditions emerging in conversation with, rather than in opposition to the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. The history of human knowledge might have been continuous rather than repeatedly interrupted. The progress that we now celebrate as modern achievement might have come millennia earlier if each generation had not been forced to rediscover what previous generations had already known and lost. But that is not what happened. What happened was erasure, layer upon layer, until the very existence of Babylonian achievement was forgotten, until the cuneiform signs became meaningless scratches on clay that Europeans used as packing material for more interesting artifacts, until the civilization that had given us the hours and the minutes and the degrees was reduced to a byword for chaos and sin. And yet, and this is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the entire story, erasure is never quite complete. Something always survives. Not the texts necessarily, not the explicit knowledge, but something deeper, something embedded so thoroughly in practice that it passes from generation to generation without anyone remembering its origin. You used Babylonian mathematics this morning when you checked the time. The 60-minute hour and the 60-second minute are Babylonian, relics of their base 60 numerical system that proved so useful for astronomical calculation that no subsequent civilization bothered to replace it, even when they replaced everything else. You used Babylonian astronomy last night. If you glanced at the stars and recognized a constellation, because the zodiac is Babylonian, the 12 signs mapped onto the ecliptic by observers in Mesopotamian temples more than 3,000 years ago. You used Babylonian geometry whenever you measured an angle, because the 360-degree circle is Babylonian, arbitrary from a mathematical perspective, but preserved across millennia because it divides so conveniently by the numbers that mattered to astronomical calculation. You carry Babylonian legal concepts in your assumptions about justice, because the idea that law should be written and public and applicable to all, the idea that punishment should be proportionate to crime, the idea that contracts should be enforceable and commerce should be regulated, all of this has roots in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, even if those roots have been buried beneath layers of Greek and Roman and European legal development. The Babylonians are dead. Their language fell silent 2,000 years ago. Their cities are dust. But they live in you, in the structure of your day, in the pattern of your stars. They're in the shape of your expectations about how society should function. This is survival through transformation, through embedding so deep that consciousness is not required, through becoming so fundamental that forgetting the origin does not prevent the transmission. Astrology, dismissed now as superstition, as pseudoscience, as entertainment for the credulous, astrology is degraded Babylonian astronomy, the mathematical precision stripped away and the predictive framework preserved as hollow ritual. Somewhere along the transmission from Babylon to Greece, to Rome, to medieval Europe, to the horoscope section of your local newspaper, the sophisticated observational science became fortune-telling. The careful calculations became sun sign personality types. The accumulated data of centuries became 12 generic paragraphs applicable to anyone. And yet, even in its degraded form, astrology preserves the Babylonian insight that the heavens move in patterns, that those patterns can be mapped, that human life unfolds beneath a canopy of celestial regularity. The insight survives, even when the precision is lost. The framework persists, even when the content has been replaced with nonsense. This is how knowledge survives catastrophe, not intact, not accurately, but embedded in practice, transformed beyond recognition, but still carrying traces of its origin for anyone who knows how to look. How much else survives that we have not yet recognized? How many of our habits and assumptions and unexamined practices contain Babylonian DNA that we have not traced back to its source? The cuneiform tablets in museum basements number in the hundreds of thousands. Most remain untranslated, and most have never been systematically studied. We know what Babylon gave us in mathematics and astronomy and law because those were the fields that interested the first translators, the 19th century Europeans who deciphered cuneiform and published what they found remarkable. But what else is in those tablets that we have not yet thought to look for? What medical knowledge, what engineering principles, what psychological insights, what philosophical frameworks might be waiting in those clay archives for someone to ask the right questions? The erasure was thorough, but thorough is not complete. Something always survives, and perhaps more survives than we have yet discovered. Let your breathing slow now. Let the analytical mind relax its grip. You have followed the pattern across millennia, traced the layers of erasure, glimpsed what survived despite everything. Now let us stand together in the ruins, not the ruins as they are today, damaged and diminished and surrounded by desert, but the ruins as imagination can reconstruct them, the ghost of the city overlaid upon its bones. Close your eyes if you have not already. Feel the heat of a Mesopotamian afternoon, the sun standing directly overhead, the shadows pooled at the base of walls that rise higher than any building you have ever entered. The Ishtar Gate towers before you, glazed bricks of lapis blue depicting lions and dragons and bulls in procession, the sacred way passing through into the ceremonial heart of the city. The smell of incense drifts from 100 temples. The sound of chanting echoes from the ziggurat that rises in stepped platforms toward the heavens, the Itemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, its summit crowned with a shrine where priests track the movements of planets and record observations that will prove accurate for millennia after the city itself has fallen. The Euphrates flows through the center of the city, its waters channeled into canals that branch and rebranch until every district has access, until gardens bloom in the desert, until what should be wasteland becomes the greatest city the world has ever known. People crowd the streets, speaking a dozen languages, bringing goods and ideas from Egypt and India and the Mediterranean coast, from the mountains of Anatolia and the shores of the Persian Gulf. Scribes sit in temple courtyards pressing wedge shapes into wet clay, recording contracts and observations and stories and calculations. He is creating the archive that will be buried and forgotten and rediscovered, and that even now, even after all this time, has not been fully read. Hold that image for a moment. Let it live in your imagination. Then watch it fade. Watch the centuries accelerate, the city emptying, the canals silting, the temples crumbling, the ziggurat collapsing tier by tier until only a mound remains. Watch the desert reclaim what irrigation had held at bay. Watch the bricks scatter and the tablets bury themselves in sediment and sand. Watch the languages change, the people who remember growing old and dying, their children knowing less, their grandchildren knowing nothing, until Babylon is only a name in old books, a curse in holy texts, a metaphor for everything fallen and corrupt. Like watch the archaeologists arrive with their tools and their theories and their limited funding, scratching at the surface of what was once the center of the world. Watch the soldiers build their base and the looters dig their pits, and the tablets enter the black market and scatter across the globe and lose their context and become curiosities rather than knowledge. The city is gone. The empire is gone. The language is gone. The people who lived and loved and worked and died within those walls are gone so completely that we do not even know their individual names except for kings and priests whose inscriptions survived. And yet, something remains. The tablets remain, waiting. The patterns remain, embedded in our hours and our circles and our legal assumptions. The questions remain, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, about what else we might have known if the erasure had been less thorough. You are standing in ruins, ruins of a city, ruins of a civilization, ruins of a continuity of knowledge that was interrupted so severely that we are still measuring the loss. But ruins are not nothing. Ruins are evidence. Ruins are invitation. Ruins are the starting point for reconstruction, however partial, however speculative, however haunted by awareness of what can never be recovered. What are we erasing now? This question has hovered beneath the surface of our entire journey, and perhaps now, as sleep approaches, it is time to let it surface fully. Our civilization stores its knowledge differently than the Babylonians stored theirs, in electronic formats rather than clay tablets, in server farms rather than temple libraries, in code that requires electricity and specific hardware and software to read. We have created more knowledge in the last century than in all of human history before, and we have stored it in the most fragile medium we have ever devised. Hard drives fail. File formats become obsolete. Servers require maintenance and power, and the stable social structures that enable both. If our civilization experienced the kind of disruption that Babylon experienced, the cascading collapses that can follow invasion or pandemic or climate catastrophe, how much of what we know would survive? The clay tablets endured 2,000 years of burial and remained readable. The average hard drive lasts perhaps a decade before failure. The average file format remains supported for perhaps a generation before software moves on and old files become inaccessible. We are creating knowledge at unprecedented rates and storing it in unprecedented fragility, trusting that continuity will persist, that the infrastructure will hold, that the formats will remain readable, that someone will always be there to maintain the servers and update the software and transfer the data to whatever comes next. But the Babylonians trusted too. They built libraries and trained scribes and recorded observations and assumed that the process would continue, that their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would read what they had written and add their own observations and pass the accumulated total forward. They were wrong. We might be wrong too. What knowledge are we allowing to disappear through neglect, through format obsolescence, through the simple failure to transfer important data before the hardware dies? What indigenous languages are falling silent, taking with them entire worldviews and knowledge systems that exist nowhere else? What oral traditions are fading as elders die without passing their stories to children who have been taught that traditional knowledge is primitive and unnecessary? What are we erasing, not through malice, not through conquest, but through the simple accumulation of decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation, but collectively add up to catastrophic loss? You cannot stop this process alone. No individual can. The forces of erasure are too large, too distributed, too embedded in the economics and incentives of modern society. But you can participate in preservation. You can choose what you pass forward, what stories you tell, what knowledge you value enough to share. You can be one link in a chain that stretches back to Babylonian scribes, pressing wedges into clay, and forward to whoever inherits whatever remains of what we know. The Babylonians could not have imagined you. They could not have predicted that their tablets would be dug from desert mounds and shipped to museums and deciphered by scholars who spoke languages that did not yet exist when the clay was wet. But they preserved anyway. They recorded anyway. They trusted that someone, sometime, would find value in what they knew. And they were right, even though they could not have known they would be right, even though the gap between their writing and our reading spanned longer than their civilization existed. Perhaps someone in the far future, someone we cannot imagine, will look back at our time the same way we look back at Babylon. They will sift through whatever remains of our archives, physical and digital and oral. They will piece together what we knew from fragments and guesses and the patterns embedded in practices that survived even when their origins were forgotten. They will wonder about us the same way we wonder about the scribes of Esagila. And if we have done our part, if we have preserved what matters, if we have passed forward not just data but understanding, they will find something worth finding. Not everything. Erasure is never complete, but neither is preservation. Something is always lost, but something always survives. That is the lesson of Babylon, the lesson written in clay and confirmed by every generation of discovery and loss since the last cuneiform scribe put down his stylus. Let that lesson settle into you as sleep approaches. Let the weight of history become a comfort rather than a burden. You are part of this, part of the long chain of preservation and loss, part of the ongoing effort to carry knowledge forward across the gaps that catastrophe creates. You did not choose this role. No one does. But you fill it anyway, simply by being human, simply by learning and remembering and sharing what you know. The Cyrus cylinder sits in its case in the British Museum, room 52, the ancient Iran gallery. The climate control hums softly. The lights are dim, preserving the artifact from damage. The cuneiform inscription remains readable after 2,500 years, the wedge shapes still crisp in the clay, still carrying the message that Cyrus wanted carried, the propaganda that shaped how the world understood Babylon's fall. In and beneath the propaganda, if you know how to read it, lies evidence of what was lost. The cylinder mentions Marduk and Esagila, and the restoration of temples and the return of exiled peoples. It assumes that its readers will know what these references mean, will understand the significance of the gods named and the cities referenced, and the political claims being made. For 2,000 years, no one could read those references. The knowledge required to understand them had been erased so thoroughly that the cylinder was mere mysterious artifact, its significance guessed at but not grasped. Now we can read it again. We have reassembled enough of what was lost to understand what Cyrus was claiming and why his claims mattered. But we reassembled that understanding from fragments, from survivals, from the incomplete record that weathered the erasure. We will never have everything. We will always be reading through gaps. The cylinder waits, patient, carrying its message to whoever will listen, evidence of conquest and propaganda, and the long process by which one civilization replaces another and rewrites the story of what came before. If you visit the museum, if you stand before the case and look at the small clay barrel covered in ancient writing, remember what it represents. Not just the first declaration of human rights, though that is how the museum labels it. Not just Persian propaganda, though that is what it functionally was. But a survivor. An artifact that weathered the erasure, that carried knowledge across the gap. That speaks to us now because someone made it, and someone preserved it, and someone eventually learned again how to hear what it says. That is what matters. Not the specific content, which is political and partial and biased like all historical sources, but the survival, the continuity, the proof that erasure is never quite complete, that something always makes it through, that the effort of preservation is not wasted even when the gap between writing and reading spans millennia. Let that thought be the last one you carry into sleep. The tablets survived. The knowledge survived, not all of it, never all of it, but enough. Enough to know that something remarkable once existed. Enough to glimpse what was lost. Enough to inspire the search for more. And you, lying here in the dark, breathing slowly, consciousness fading, you are part of that search. You are the latest in the long line of those who want to know, who refuse to accept that what was erased is gone forever, who believe that understanding the past matters for navigating the future. Sleep now. Dream of libraries and temples, of scribes pressing clay and priests watching stars, of cities rising and falling and rising again, of knowledge buried and discovered and passed forward across the gaps that separate us from those who came before. Dream of Babylon, not the metaphor of sin and judgment, but the reality of human achievement and human loss, the first great civilization to reach for universal knowledge and the first to have that reach systematically severed. Dream of what survives despite everything. Dream of what you might preserve, what you might pass forward, what might endure because of choices you make that you cannot yet imagine. The Euphrates still flows, though its course has shifted. The mound of Babel still rises from the Iraqi plain, though war and neglect and looting have damaged what remains. The tablets still wait in their museum cases, their cuneiforms still readable, their messages still arriving across the millennia. And you, wherever you are, whatever time it is, you are receiving those messages now. You are completing a circuit of communication that began when Babylonian scribes first pressed wedges into wet clay, trusting that someone would read, trusting that knowledge was worth preserving, trusting that the future would care what the past had learned. They were right to trust. We are here. We are listening. And as you drift into sleep, as consciousness dissolves into dream, would you carry that trust with you? Carry the knowledge that preservation matters, that understanding matters, that the long chain of human learning stretches backward and forward further than any individual life can span. You are a link in that chain. Rest now. The tablets will wait. They have been patient for 5,000 years. They can be patient a little longer. And when you wake, the questions will still be there, the mysteries still unsolved, the search still continuing. But for now, sleep. Dream of Babylon. Dream of what was lost and what survives and what might yet be found. The story continues without you for these few hours. It will welcome you back when you wake. Good night.